Before humans ever walked on the moon, before satellites mapped our weather, before GPS told you where to turn, someone had to figure out how to leave Earth in the first place. And that someone wasn't exactly who you'd expect. His name was Robert Goddard, and in the early 1900s, he was convinced that rockets could one day reach space. Not just fly high, actually leave Earth's atmosphere. People thought he was insane. The New York Times mocked him in 1920, publishing an editorial saying he clearly lacked the basic knowledge that high school students learn. They were talking about the idea that a rocket could work in a vacuum, in space, where there's no air. They were wrong, completely wrong, but the damage was done. Goddard became a punchline. He kept working anyway. On March 16th, 1926, in a frozen field in Auburn, Massachusetts, Goddard launched the world's first liquid-fueled rocket. It flew for about 2.5 seconds. It reached a height of roughly 40 feet. To most people, that sounds like nothing, but it was everything. Because for the first time, a controlled, liquid-fueled rocket had actually left the ground. The era of modern rocketry had just begun, and almost no one noticed. Goddard spent the next 2 decades refining his designs. He developed gyroscopes for guidance, fuel pumps, parachute recovery systems. He basically invented the blueprint for every rocket that came after him, and he did most of it alone, out of the spotlight, in the desert of New Mexico. When he died in 1945, he still hadn't received the recognition he deserved. The New York Times printed a correction, 49 years after their original editorial. Rockets, it turns out, work perfectly fine in a vacuum. Here's where the story takes a dark turn. While Goddard was tinkering in the American desert, another group of engineers on the other side of the world had been reading his papers closely, the Germans. And they weren't building rockets for science. They were building them for war. By World War II, Nazi Germany had developed the V-2 rocket, the world's first ballistic missile. It could travel over 200 miles and hit targets with terrifying accuracy. Thousands of them were launched at London, Antwerp, and other Allied cities, killing thousands of civilians. The man behind it was Wernher von Braun, a brilliant engineer who had dreamed of space travel since he was a teenager. He'd built a weapon of mass destruction to keep his program funded. It's one of the most complicated moral legacies in the history of science. When Germany fell, both the United States and the Soviet Union made a mad dash to capture German rocket technology and the engineers behind it. The Americans got von Braun and about 100 of his top scientists. They brought them to the US under a secret program called Operation Paperclip, former Nazi engineers, now working for America. This was the uncomfortable foundation that the US space program was built on. Fast forward to October 4th, 1957. The Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the world's first satellite. It was about the size of a beach ball, and it didn't do much except beep. But that beep heard around the world sent America into a panic. If the Soviets could put a satellite in orbit, they could put a nuclear warhead anywhere on the planet. Congress moved fast. NASA was created in 1958, and von Braun and his team were put to work. The early years were rough. American rockets kept blowing up on the launch pad. One launch was so embarrassing, it earned the nickname Flopnik. The Soviets were beating the US at nearly every milestone. First satellite, first animal in space, first human in space. Then came Kennedy. On May 25th, 1961, President John F. Kennedy stood before Congress and made a promise that seemed completely impossible. The United States would land a man on the moon before the end of the decade. Not because it was easy, he later said, because it was hard. To get to the moon, NASA needed a rocket unlike anything ever built. What they created was the Saturn V. Let's put this in perspective. The Saturn V stands 363 feet tall, taller than the Statue of Liberty. It weighs 6.2 million pounds when fully fueled. It produces 7.6 million pounds of thrust at launch. It remains, to this day, the most powerful rocket ever successfully flown. Von Braun led the team that built it. Hundreds of thousands of engineers, contractors, and workers across the country contributed. At its peak, the Apollo program employed over 400,000 people. On July 16, 1969, Saturn V launched Apollo 11. 4 days later, Neil Armstrong stepped onto the moon. The kid from Wapakoneta, Ohio, took one small step, and the world held its breath. 6 more missions followed. 12 human beings walked on another world, and then it stopped. The 1970s were a strange time for American rocketry. The excitement faded. Budgets were cut. The Saturn V program was canceled. 3 completed rockets ended up as museum displays, never to fly. NASA shifted focus. The Space Shuttle era began in 1981. A new kind of spacecraft designed to be reusable. The idea was to make spaceflight routine and affordable. Reality was more complicated. The shuttle was expensive, complex, and tragically, not as safe as hoped. The Challenger disaster in 1986 and Columbia in 2003 each took the lives of 7 astronauts and shook the program to its core. Still, the shuttle flew 135 missions over 30 years. It built the International Space Station. It deployed the Hubble Space Telescope. It did things no other vehicle could do. When the shuttle retired in 2011, America temporarily lost the ability to launch its own astronauts into space. For nearly a decade, NASA paid Russia to carry its astronauts to the ISS on Soviet-era rockets. Then something unexpected happened. Private companies entered the race. Elon Musk founded SpaceX in 2002 with a goal that sounded just as crazy as Goddard's had a century earlier: make humanity a multiplanetary species. The early rockets failed, spectacularly. But SpaceX kept iterating, kept launching, kept failing forward. In 2020, SpaceX flew NASA astronauts to the International Space Station, the first time American rockets carried American astronauts from American soil since the shuttle's retirement. The rocket was reusable. The boosters landed themselves back on Earth, upright, ready to fly again. And then came Starship, the largest and most powerful rocket ever built. Standing nearly 400 feet tall with over 16 million pounds of thrust, it's designed to carry humans to Mars. Test flights are ongoing. The dream that started in a frozen field in Massachusetts in 1926 is still very much alive. From Goddard's 40-foot flame in a snow-covered field to a rocket landing itself on a drone ship in the middle of the ocean, the story of American rocketry is really a story about stubbornness. If you want to see more stories like this, hit subscribe. There's a lot more where this came from.